1970, Jan L. Dewar and Ross D. Park conducted an experimental study, the findings of which were published in the journal Developmental Psychology, Volume 2, Number 3. The study was titled Effects of Inconsistent Punishment on Aggression in Children. This study investigated the various means by which aggressive behavior could be inhibited in children. The paper opens giving background on the importance of curbing aggressive behavior in children due to the issues it poses on both a personal and on a societal level. The introduction also highlighted that the literature available at the time did not categorically conclude that punishment reduces aggressive behavior, as the various data available was often conflicting. The overall aim of the paper was to investigate how different kinds of reinforcement in response to the aggressive behavior of children helped to inhibit that behavior. Firstly, how consistent punishment compared to inconsistent punishment in this role. Secondly, the study aimed to examine the relationship between the conditions under which the behavior was initially acquired and to determine how that affected how difficult it was to later inhibit the behavior once learned. Specifically, if a participant is initially consistently rewarded for aggressive behavior, will that behavior be more difficult to inhibit at a later date when compared with a participant whose initial aggressive behavior received no reward? In terms of these questions, several hypotheses were made. Firstly, it was hypothesized that when aggressive behaviors were met with punishment, then those behaviors would be inhibited to a greater degree than if they were not met with any response. Secondly, it was hypothesized that if children were intermittently rewarded and punished for their aggressive behavior during the acquisition phase, that behavior would be more persistent when all reinforcement of the behavior was later withdrawn. That is, in comparison to initial consistent reward of aggressive behavior. Thirdly, it was hypothesized that if children were intermittently rewarded and punished for their aggressive behavior during the acquisition phase, in comparison to being continuously rewarded, then that behavior will be more persistent when continuous punishment for such behavior was later administered. The study consisted of 120 participants. All participants were boys taken from the first, second and third grades of 2 schools. 102 were taken from one school and 18 were taken from another. All boys were between the ages of 17 and 113 months. All participants were Caucasian and came from upper middle class backgrounds. Furthermore, any boy found to be undergoing regular psychotherapy was excluded from the study. In terms of the study methodology, the basic premise revolved around what sort of response the participants received when they punched a clown doll. The participants were organized into one of 6 treatment groups, of 20 boys in each group. For the sake of clarity, these groups shall be termed A, B, C, D, E, and F. The study was broken into 2 stages: the acquisition stage, in which the participants received a particular response when they struck the doll, and the extinction phase, in which the aggressive behavior of the participants is discouraged through one means or another. The acquisition phase consisted of 18 instances of aggression and response. Groups A and B would receive a reward in the form of a marble for every time they hit the doll. Groups C and D received a marble 50% of the times that they punched the doll and received no reinforcement the other 50% of the times. Groups E and F received a reward for 50% of the times that they punched the doll and a punishment in the form of a loud buzzer for the other 50% of the times. In the subsequent extinction phase, further aggressive behavior was met with alternate responses in order to gauge the persistence of the behavior. Participants from groups A, C, and E were punished via the buzzer every time that they hit the doll. Participants from groups B, D, and F were given no reinforcement one way or another when they hit the doll. No rewards were given during the extinction phase. Children voluntarily stopped the sessions when they had had enough. The results gained through this experiment showed that during the extinction phase of the experiment, consistent punishment of aggression was more effective at inhibiting the behavior than was consistent non-reinforcement. This was shown to be the case across each treatment group. Those participants who had received rewards 100% of the time in response to aggressive behavior during the acquisition phase ceased that aggressive behavior most rapidly in response to the extinction phase conditions. Those that had experienced 50% reward and 50% non-reinforcement in the acquisition phase ceased their aggressive behavior second most rapidly, Finally, those that had experienced 50% reward and 50% punishment in the acquisition phase ceased their aggressive behaviour the least rapidly, thereby showing that the aggressive behaviour had greatest persistence among these groups. The mean number of punches that each treatment group gave to the doll during the extinction phase can be seen in this graph here. The white columns represent those groups that underwent consistent punishment, while the shaded columns represent those that underwent non-reinforcement. The conclusion that was drawn from the study was that consistent punishment was more effective at inhibiting aggressive behaviour than consistent non-reinforcement of that behaviour. It was also shown, however, that the efficacy of both consistent punishment and consistent non-reinforcement was dependent upon what sort of reinforcement, if any, that child had been given in the past in response to aggressive behaviour. For example, it was shown that children who were consistently rewarded for aggressive behaviour show less persistence in that behaviour when they are confronted with punishment or non-reinforcement. On the other hand, children who were intermittently rewarded and non-reinforced for aggressive behaviour during acquisition were shown to be more persistent in their aggressive behaviours when confronted with consistent punishment or non-reinforcement. Finally, those boys who were intermittently rewarded and punished for aggressive behaviour in the acquisition phase showed the greatest persistence in their aggressive behaviour in the extinction phase in response to consistent punishment or non-reinforcement. Ultimately, what this shows is that the conditions in which the behaviours were initially learned greatly affects the conditions needed for the behaviours to be unlearned. Children who have had inconsistent punishment of aggressive behaviour in the past are likely to be more persistent in their aggressive behaviours in the future when confronted with consistent punishment or non-reinforcement. Despite the compelling data gained through this study, there are ultimately some limitations. Firstly, the sample consists of a very narrow subset of the population, namely Caucasian upper middle class boys between a particular age group. While the data is useful for people within this group, it cannot reliably be applied to children from the wider population. This is due to the fact that the sample itself is not representative of the wider population. Similarly, factors like the temperament of the child and the past history of how they had been punished were not taken into account, which could possibly confound the results of the study. Thank you.